They say betrayal never comes from your enemies, and they are right. It comes wrapped in the familiar, in the eyes that once tucked you into bed, in the voices that once called you my child, my brother, my blood. It comes from Sunday dinners, from old photographs on mantels, from the people you once believed would stand beside you until the end. And when they turn, when their words cut, and their silence becomes louder than any scream, you don't just lose them. You lose the illusion. It's a peculiar kind of grief. You know, the kind that doesn't come with funerals or sympathy cards. It's quiet. It festers in the silence. It wakes you up at 2 a.m., not with nightmares, but with memories that used to feel safe. Betrayal by your family doesn't just hurt, it rewires your sense of self. You begin to question if love was ever real, if loyalty was ever more than convenience. But here's the truth. You weren't betrayed because you were weak. You were betrayed because you were strong, because you saw light in people who had long since abandoned their own. Because your heart was open, and theirs was closed like a rusted gate, and so they turned on you not because you failed, but because your presence reminded them of what they chose not to become. Let that sink in. Most people will never understand what it feels like to mourn someone who is still alive, to walk around with scars no one can see because the world expects you to smile, to keep the family secrets, to stay silent for the sake of peace. But peace built on betrayal is just polite oppression, and silence in the face of emotional violence is complicity. You do not owe your loyalty to those who poisoned the well you drank from. They will call you selfish for walking away. Let them. They will rewrite history to soothe their conscience. Let them. Your duty is not to fix what they broke. Your duty is to protect the unbroken parts of yourself, the parts that still believe in kindness, in truth, in your own potential. You must understand something vital. Family is not who shares your blood. Family is who protects your soul. You are allowed to grieve what was, but you are also allowed to build something better, to choose people who see you, truly see you, and do not shrink when your light grows brighter. You are allowed to say, "This ends with me." There is a terrifying freedom in betrayal, because once it happens, once the veil is lifted, you are no longer bound by the illusion. You stop seeking approval from people who only celebrated your silence. You stop twisting yourself into shapes to fit a mold that was never meant to honor your true form. You begin, at long last, to live. Do not let betrayal harden you, let it awaken you. Let it be the fire that burns away the false and makes room for what's real. You have survived. That is your proof of strength. You are still standing. That is your rebellion. You are still capable of love. That is your victory. Forgiveness, that's up to you. But understand that forgiveness is not reconciliation. You do not need to sit at the same table to prove you've healed. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is close the door and never open it again, not out of hate, but out of respect for your own peace. Let them think you're bitter. Let them talk. Let them invent versions of you that feel safer than the truth, because the truth is you rose. They underestimated you, and still you rose. You stopped bleeding for people who never once noticed the color red. And that, dear soul, is the beginning of everything. You were betrayed, yes, but now you are free. There are wounds that don't bleed, not on the skin, not on the surface where the world can see and sympathize. These are internal lacerations, inflicted not by enemies with blades, but by loved ones with silence, with lies, with calculated distance. Betrayal from a stranger is forgettable, but when blood betrays you, it echoes through every hallway of your memory. The pain doesn't come all at once. It arrives in fragments, a missed call, a cold glance, a promise made and quietly broken. And then, one day, it dawns on you the people you thought were your anchor have been holding you underwater. Not because they didn't care, but because they never truly saw you as more than a tool, a burden, a rival, or a shadow. You expect storms from the world, but not from home. You prepare yourself for the disappointments of lovers and the deceit of strangers. But not this, not the aching silence of family dinners where love once lived, not the subtle rejection that follows every dream you share, not the condescending smiles that tell you they wish you'd shrink back into something smaller, something easier to dismiss. And still, you keep hoping. That's the worst part, the persistence of hope. That maybe they'll come around, that maybe it was a misunderstanding, that maybe if you achieve more, behave better, speak softer, they will find their way back to the warmth you offer. But every attempt becomes a transaction. Every kind gesture is measured and weighed against their quiet resentment. You begin to question your own reality. Were you ever loved, or were you merely convenient? A name to be called when times were hard, a body to lift burdens, a listening ear in a house full of noise. You start to feel foolish for all the ways you tried, all the times you forgave too quickly, apologized too often, gave too much of yourself in exchange for their approval. It's a spiritual violence, betrayal from blood. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It seeps into the foundation of your identity, making you doubt your own worth. Because if the people who raised you, grew up with you, shared your history, if they don't see your value, then who will? That's the thought that haunts you most in the quiet hours. You carry them with you, even in your distance. In every achievement you wish they could see. In every failure you hear their judgment. In every laugh there's a shadow of what could have been if they had simply chosen loyalty over envy, presence over absence, compassion over control. And yet they didn't, and now you live in the aftermath. What they don't realize is that betrayal rearranges the architecture of the soul. You begin to walk differently, talk differently, trust differently. It's not that you become bitter, it's that you become careful. You no longer build homes in other people. You build doors with locks and windows with curtains, not because you hate them, but because you've learned what happens when you leave yourself unguarded. Sometimes it feels like mourning the living. They're still there laughing, eating, pretending, but you've buried what they once were to you. And that grief, it doesn't go away. It lingers like perfume on a coat you no longer wear but can't bring yourself to throw away. You smell it, and suddenly you're back there hoping again, hurting again, betrayed again. You learn to smile in public, even when your soul is fractured. You become the strong one, the one who got over it. But inside, you carry the ashes of the love you gave them, love they squandered, manipulated, ignored. And yet, despite it all, you never truly hate them. You hate what they did. You hate who they became. But hating them, that would require you to erase the good, and you can't do that even now. You speak less of them over time, not because they don't cross your mind, but because no one really understands unless they've lived it. Unless they've felt the sting of hearing a sibling echo your deepest insecurities as jokes. Unless they've watched a parent choose pride over reconciliation. Unless they've felt the loneliness of being the only one at the family table who speaks the truth. And so you wander not lost, but searching for people who offer love without condition, for friends who become more like siblings than the ones you were born with, for moments that feel like home, even if they're far from where you began. You search not to replace, but to rebuild, to gather the pieces of yourself they didn't bother to keep. You become someone new, not in spite of the betrayal, but because of it. Because pain, when processed, becomes fuel. And betrayal, when faced, becomes a mirror. You look into it, and you see who you really are, not the version they painted in anger, not the scapegoat they needed to avoid accountability, but the real you. Scarred, yes, but still standing, still loving, still whole. It's a kind of rebirth, almost. Not beautiful in a cinematic way, but in the quiet, gritty, real way that survival often is. You stop looking for their love and start cultivating your own. You stop begging to be seen and start embracing the parts of yourself they were blind to. And as strange as it feels, you begin to feel free. You learn that healing doesn't require them to change. It doesn't require their apology. It doesn't even require their presence. Healing is yours to claim. Once you stop expecting the wound to be fixed by the hand that caused it, you recognize the strength it takes to keep loving in a world where those who should have loved you first failed to. You recognize that the pain didn't destroy you, it refined you, it made you more compassionate, more discerning, more grounded in your own worth. You stop needing them to validate your version of the story. Because you were there, you felt it, And that's enough. You don't need to convince anyone else of the truth. You just need to live it, quietly, fiercely, without apology. You begin to understand that betrayal by blood was not the end of your story. It was the moment you began to write your own. There's a cruel kind of magic in the beginning, a trick of the mind, a stage set by tradition and blood, where loyalty is assumed, not earned. You're taught to believe that family is synonymous with safety, that love is automatic, that protection is inevitable. And so, you walk blindly into the illusion, offering your trust like a gift to those who share your name. But slowly, the mask begins to slip. You notice the subtle shifts, the questions you ask that go unanswered, the celebrations you're no longer invited to. The warmth that once surrounded your presence begins to fade, replaced by a cold civility, a polite distance, a rehearsed smile that never reaches the eyes. You're still family, but only on paper, only when convenient. You begin to realize that blood, in and of itself, holds no real loyalty. Loyalty requires choice, and not everyone in your family chooses you. Some resent you quietly, some dismiss you completely, and some simply forget you exist when you are no longer useful. And that realization doesn't come with a loud confrontation. It arrives quietly, in the absence of effort, in the silence where love used to speak. It's disorienting. How do you reconcile shared memories with present indifference? How do you make sense of being raised alongside people who now look at you as if you are a stranger on a train, someone they pass by without recognition? You search their faces for remnants of the bond you once believed was unbreakable, but all you find is distance dressed up as civility. There's no betrayal like the one that wears the mask of politeness. It's not overt, it's not loud, it's calculated. They don't argue, they don't shout. They simply erase you quietly, from plans, from conversations, from their hearts, and because there's no fight to respond to, you're left fighting your own confusion, questioning your worth, wondering what invisible crime you committed to deserve exile. You think back to all the moments you defended them, loved them, protected them. You remember the holidays spent together, the hospital visits, the shared secrets in the middle of the night, and you wonder, was it ever real for them, or were you just a placeholder until something better, easier, more agreeable came along? The hardest part isn't the loss itself, it's the gaslighting that follows, the denial, the rewriting of history, the subtle implication that you're overreacting, too sensitive, dramatic. They tell you nothing's changed, that you're imagining things. And for a while you want to believe them, you really do, because the alternative means accepting that those closest to you have emotionally abandoned you by choice. And so you learn to sit with the ache. Not the heartbreak of romantic love, but the hollow ache of familial abandonment, a different kind of loneliness, one that echoes through your bones, one that no amount of logic can quiet, because this betrayal wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to be your constant in a world of variables. You start noticing your own behavior changing. You speak less. You expect less. You celebrate your victories in silence. You mourn your losses alone. You stop offering explanations for your absence. You simply retreat, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. You realize that forcing your presence into spaces where you are barely tolerated is a quiet form of self-harm. They might still speak to you. They might still call you on birthdays or include you in group messages, but it's no longer about connection, it's about appearances. It's about keeping the illusion alive. And once you see it for what it is, you can never unsee it. The loyalty you thought was solid was paper, thin, conditional, performative. You begin to redefine what family means. You realize it's not about shared blood, but shared loyalty. Shared presence, shared accountability, and you start looking for it in new places, in friendships that feel like home, in mentors who speak life into you, in strangers who treat you with more care than those who watched you grow up. It changes you, this slow, quiet excommunication. It sobers you, it grounds you, it strips away the fantasy and leaves you with the truth. Some people carry the title of family, but lack the capacity to love deeply. They're attached to the idea of you, not the reality. They love your silence, not your voice, your compliance, not your growth, and so you grow away from them, not out of vengeance but necessity. You stop waiting for the call that never comes. You stop expecting apologies that will never be spoken. You stop reopening old wounds just to prove you were hurt. You start healing in private, far from the illusion, far from the table where your absence goes unnoticed. You carry the lessons with you heavy, sacred, unforgettable. You learn that love without loyalty is manipulation, that shared blood does not guarantee shared values, that sometimes the only way to preserve your dignity is to walk away quietly, without theatrics, without revenge. Just distance, just peace. You begin to see yourself clearly, not through their lens, but your own. You reclaim the pieces of you they ignored. You restore the self-worth they tried to chip away with passive neglect. And you no longer seek belonging from those who couldn't be bothered to make space for your truth. You belong to yourself now, and that is more than enough. There's a cruelty so quiet it almost feels like care. It hides behind familiar words. It wears the costume of concern. It arrives not with a slap, but a whisper, not in anger, but in tradition. And it says, "I'm doing this because I love you." That phrase, so seemingly noble, becomes the weapon. They use it not to heal, but to justify the wound. They break you, and then call it discipline. They silence you, and then call it protection. And because you want love, because you were raised to need it from them, you accept the pain. You tell yourself it must be love, because what else could it be? Surely the people who held your hand as a child wouldn't now be the architects of your confusion. So you excuse it, you cover it with logic, with memory, with the loyalty that only blood can birth. And in doing so, you begin to doubt yourself instead of them. They correct your voice when it trembles with truth. They call your ambitions unrealistic, your emotions dramatic, your perspective flawed. And every word is delivered with a smile, a sigh, a hand on your shoulder. It's not abuse, they say. It's advice, it's guidance, it's love. But it feels like a slow erosion, like the gradual fading of color from the canvas of who you are. You try to speak about the way their words cut. You try to express that their silence feels like punishment, that their manipulation is not the same as love, but you're met with dismissal. You're too sensitive. You always make everything about you. You don't understand what family means. And suddenly you're the villain for feeling, for noticing, for defending your soul against the very people who should have guarded it. You begin to learn the terrible truth that love, in its purest form, cannot coexist with control. And yet here you are, being controlled under the banner of love, made to feel small under the guise of care, shamed into gratitude for crumbs of affection that are given conditionally, that come with invisible contracts and unspoken debts. You find yourself changing, not blooming but bending, shrinking parts of yourself so they're easier to swallow, hiding your joy because it makes them uncomfortable, dimming your light because your confidence sounds like arrogance to them. And still they claim to love you, but it's not love they offer. It's possession. It's a demand for obedience. It's the performance of affection so long as you play your part in their script. And the script is always the same: loyalty over truth, silence over conflict, tradition over evolution. Any attempt to rewrite it is seen as betrayal. If you grow beyond the roles they assign to you, you're accused of abandoning the family. If you speak your truth, you're disrespecting your elders. If you heal, you're seen as ungrateful for the pain they inflicted. You start realizing love is not supposed to feel like negotiation. You shouldn't have to plead for empathy. You shouldn't have to tiptoe around those who claim to love you, afraid that one misstep will lead to rejection. Real love doesn't use guilt as currency. It doesn't condition its presence on your conformity. It doesn't sting more than it soothes. And yet, here you are, trying to build a bridge with someone who keeps setting fire to your end of it. They say they miss you, but never ask why you left. They say they love you, but never ask how you feel. They want access to your life, but not responsibility for the harm they caused within it. They want the comfort of your presence without the discomfort of accountability. So you begin to question, what if this isn't love? What if I've been calling something love that never actually was? What if I've spent years trying to earn the approval of people who can only offer control? And in those questions, you start to breathe differently. You stop begging. You stop justifying. You stop needing the validation that never arrives, because true love doesn't diminish you. It doesn't make you feel like a burden. It doesn't clip your wings and call it safety. It doesn't leave you emotionally starving and then say, "Be grateful we fed you at all." True love sees you and lets you be seen. It listens. It adjusts. It evolves. It doesn't punish your growth or weaponize your vulnerability. You think about how long you accepted the pain because it was familiar. You realize how often you confused consistency for care. But a consistent wound is still a wound. A family that wounds you repeatedly and expects silence in return is not family, it's an institution built on fear, not love. And love, if it is real, never requires your silence to survive. And so you grieve, not just the betrayal, but the years spent misunderstanding love, the years you twisted yourself to fit inside their version of who you should be, the moments you kept your voice soft so theirs wouldn't rise. The birthdays you smiled through even as your heart sank. You grieve the version of yourself who thought this was the best love could be, but grief is also freedom. In grieving the illusion, you create space for something real. You begin to see that love, authentic love, is not loud with judgment, nor silent with punishment. It is honest, it is kind, it is present without performance, and you are worthy of it. You always were. Even if they never saw it, even if they still don't, there comes a moment when you realize forgiveness is not about repairing a relationship. It's about repairing yourself, not for them, not to ease their conscience, but to stop the poison from circulating in your own veins. Because resentment is a slow death, not for the person who harmed you, but for the one holding onto the fire. And yet, forgiveness doesn't mean you welcome them back into your life, as if nothing happened. That's the lie we've been told, that forgiveness and trust must travel hand in hand, but they don't. They never have. They hurt you. That is not speculation. That is not exaggeration. That is not something you're blowing out of proportion. It happened. And when you try to explain how deeply it wounded you, they refused to understand. Or worse, they understood and still did nothing. That's the part that bruises the soul, not just the betrayal itself, but the calm indifference that followed. So now you're left to pick up pieces of yourself they never had to touch. You're the one carrying the burden of silence, of pretending it doesn't still echo inside you at night. But pretending is not healing. Numbness is not peace. And revenge, no matter how tempting, is not liberation. Forgiveness is, but only when it's honest, when it doesn't erase the memory, but transforms its grip on you. You forgive because you no longer want them to have access to your emotions. You forgive because dragging their darkness into every conversation, every decision, every relationship that is exhausting. That is a prison built with your own hands, and you are done with prisons, even the invisible ones that wear your face in the mirror. But here's what they won't tell you. Forgiveness does not require a reunion. It does not mean that trust gets to grow where it was burned to ash. Trust is not a flower that blooms in scorched soil. It takes time, water, care. And sometimes it never grows back, not because you're bitter, but because you finally learn to respect your own boundaries. They may come to you later, older, perhaps even remorseful, or maybe not. Maybe they never will. Maybe they will continue to live inside a version of the story where they were always right, always justified, always the misunderstood one. But that has nothing to do with your healing. Their guilt, or lack thereof, is not your burden to manage. You are not obligated to open the door simply because someone knocks. You are not required to return to the same dynamic simply because the bloodline says so. There are people with your DNA who are more dangerous to your peace than strangers could ever be. And yet, The world insists you must welcome them with open arms, that to deny them access is cold, but wisdom often looks cold to those who benefit from your warmth. There is a strange relief in forgiving someone and knowing they will never know. You walk lighter, breathe easier, and carry no knives behind your back. You've buried the weapon, but you've also locked the gate. That distinction matters. It is not cruelty, it is clarity. It is the awareness that peace is not sustained by proximity, but by discernment. Forgiveness is yours. It is sacred. It is private. You don't owe them a ceremony. You don't owe them closure. Sometimes the most profound healing happens in the quiet. You forgive them at the kitchen sink, on a walk, in the solitude of an evening rain. You whisper it into the wind not for them to hear, but so you no longer have to carry their voice inside you. They will say you're bitter, that you've changed, that you think you're better now. They'll weaponize your growth because it reminds them of their stagnation. But don't let that tether you. Let them speak. Let them draw conclusions from a distance. Their misunderstanding of your boundaries is not your responsibility. You don't rebuild a home that once collapsed on you. You move, you start fresh, and sometimes you live alone for a while, not in isolation, but in the sanctuary of your own voice. A voice that was once drowned out by obligation, guilt, and the ache to be accepted by those incapable of giving real acceptance. When you forgive, you unshackle yourself. You say, what you did is no longer mine to hold. But when you don't rebuild trust, you say, what you did still has consequences. And both are necessary. One is release, the other is wisdom. Forgiveness without boundaries is not noble. It is self-abandonment dressed up as virtue. So you walk forward not toward them, but toward yourself, not into reconciliation, but into restoration. You have forgiven them truly. You wish them peace, even, but you no longer wish to sit at the same table. Because you remember how it felt when they handed you pain and called it love. You remember the coldness in their voice when you needed warmth. You remember, and that memory is no longer a chain, but it is a compass. There's a silence more piercing than any scream, and it often arrives after years of trying to be understood by people who were never truly listening. You speak, you reach, you beg not always in words, but in the small ways we plead for love, showing up, being loyal, forgiving too quickly. And when those gestures are met with indifference, or worse manipulation, you begin to understand that love is not always enough to keep a bond alive. Sometimes you must walk away from the very people who gave you your name. The blood may be the same, but the soul, the soul may have long since taken a different path. You may have grown into someone they cannot understand, someone who refuses to keep pretending, someone who no longer apologizes for not fitting into the mold they constructed out of their fears and limitations. And when you stop performing the version of yourself they preferred, the relationship fractures. You try to mend it. You try to shrink again to soften your truth. But the more you bend, the more you break. Until one day, something inside you says, no more. And that no is not rage. It is not rebellion. It is not even resentment. It is survival. You become the stranger not because you hate them, but because you finally recognize what has been killing you slowly, the need for their approval, the craving for their presence, the ache for their validation. Sometimes you don't just outgrow people, you outgrow the entire emotional economy they operate in. You no longer trade silence for peace. You no longer exchange your joy for a seat at the family table. You no longer mistake guilt for love, and in that clarity, a part of you detaches, not cruelly, not in vengeance, but in necessity. They'll say you've changed, of course you have. Healing changes people. Pain changes people. Survival forces you to reinvent yourself, often at the cost of being recognized by those who benefited from your wounds. When you grow, you become unrecognizable to those who preferred you broken. And yet, there is grief. not just the grief of distance, but the grief of reality the moment you realize they were never who you believed they were. You held them in your heart as protectors, allies, confidants. But when you needed them the most, they vanished, or worse, they watched and did nothing. That betrayal is not just about what they did, it's about what they didn't do when they had every opportunity to do right by you. It's a strange loneliness, becoming the outsider to your own blood, not the black sheep, but the one who finally walked out of the pen. You find yourself explaining less and less, because the truth is too sacred to waste on those who twist it. And eventually you stop explaining altogether. You embrace the stillness, the detachment, the solitude that does not suffocate, but liberates. In becoming the stranger, you reclaim your time, your mind. Your mornings, you stop rehearsing conversations that never happened. You stop waiting for apologies that would never have been sincere. You stop bleeding internally to keep the family portrait looking whole from the outside. And it is then that you realize you are not heartless, you are healing. People think family is supposed to be forever, but not all family deserves that privilege. Some family ties are better off as lessons than lifelines. You do not have to carry toxic loyalty into every year of your life simply because you share a last name. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep ancestral expectations warm. And if the cost of peace is becoming the ghost at the family reunion, then so be it. You are not running, you are not hiding, you are simply choosing to live on your own terms, not in rebellion, but in restoration. You are not obligated to preserve connections that mutilate your sense of self. They will create stories, they will fill in the blanks with gossip, with projections, with myths that soothe their egos. Let them. You are not here to convince anyone of your truth. Your truth is not on trial. Your silence is not weakness, it is mastery. A refusal to argue with people committed to misunderstanding you is not cowardice. It is maturity. In the quiet that follows your exit, you find space to remember who you were before they told you who you had to be. You rediscover the parts of yourself that had been buried beneath expectations, traditions, and unspoken family rules. You meet yourself again, this time without performance, and it feels like breathing. You become the stranger, yes, but in that becoming, you also become the self you were always meant to be, the self unshackled from emotional debts you never agreed to pay, the self that chooses peace over proximity, healing over history, and truth over tradition. You do not betray your family by leaving. Sometimes you honor yourself by doing so, and in that quiet departure, you write a new beginning. There is no perfect way to part from people who once called you their own. There is no instruction manual for walking away from a history that shaped your identity. What remains is often silence, a kind of emptiness that doesn't scream but hums steadily, not a void, but a space you're learning to fill with your own voice. The pain of betrayal is not just what was done to you, it's what was never said, never acknowledged, never apologized for, and you've carried that silence like a second skin. But here is what you've begun to understand. Your pain was not your fault, but your healing is your responsibility. That doesn't mean you condone their choices. It doesn't mean you rewrite the past to make it easier to remember. It means you choose not to be defined by what happened. You choose not to rehearse the same sorrow every morning. You choose peace even if it arrives alone. They will not understand the cost of your distance. That's not your burden. They never understood the cost of your closeness, either the nights you swallowed your truth, the days you played the part they assigned you, the years you accepted scraps of affection, hoping they might one day become love. You gave more than they saw, and now you take back what they never earned, your presence. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't look like a grand awakening. It's quiet. It's in the way you breathe a little deeper when their name comes up, and your chest doesn't tighten. It's in the moment you stop replaying the betrayal like a broken record. It's in the realization that peace is not found in fixing the family, but in freeing yourself from the idea that you ever had to. You don't need them to understand your healing. You don't need a chorus of agreement or validation. You need truth, and the truth is this: walking away was the first honest thing you did for yourself. You didn't leave to punish them. You left to protect the parts of you they were never careful with, and that choice, though painful, was sacred. The version of you that stayed too long is not weak. That version of you was hopeful, patient, loyal. And that matters, but the version of you that left, that's where your strength finally spoke. It said, I cannot keep dying in places that refuse to bury me. And in saying that, you reclaimed your life. You will grieve, of course you will. Grief doesn't require death. It shows up for what's been broken, lost, unspoken. It visits during birthdays, holidays, even in the quiet of a random afternoon. But grief doesn't mean regret. You can mourn what was while still honoring what must be. Grief is a sign that you cared, not that you were wrong. Let others romanticize family. You've seen the shadows that linger behind closed doors. You've heard love twisted into control. You've watched loyalty become currency. You know better. You've lived it. And now you choose a different path, one where connection is earned, not assumed, where love is given, not demanded. Your peace will not always be understood, especially by those who depend on your unrest to feel powerful. Let them misunderstand, let them gossip, let them label you cold. What they call cold is simply clarity. What they call distant is protection. You are not unkind, you are precise about where you place your heart now. You are allowed to love people and never speak to them again. You are allowed to forgive and still say, no, you can't come back. You are allowed to remember what they did and still rise with grace. You are allowed to be the one who breaks the pattern, even if it means being called the problem. You are not broken. You were betrayed. That distinction matters. Betrayal says more about the betrayer than it ever could about the betrayed. What you do next, the healing, the silence, the distance, the growth, that's where your story really begins. Not in the pain, but in what you choose to build from its ashes. And now you begin, not with a celebration, not with a dramatic goodbye, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift, a breath that doesn't hurt, a thought that no longer circles back to them, a morning that arrives without dread. That's how peace returns, not as a parade, but as presence. You've learned that being alone with your truth is more powerful than being surrounded by people who deny it. That solitude, when it's honest, is more nourishing than any table you were barely welcomed to. And you no longer apologize for choosing yourself. So if they call you a stranger now, let them. You're not who you were. And that's not a tragedy. That's transformation, not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but out of something far stronger, self-respect. You left the story they wrote for you, and now, finally, you're writing your own.